I think they've hidden the history or changed the history related to the Byzantine Empire. And I think that it didn't run as long as they say it did. I think that the time between the fall of Rome, the Western Empire, Western Rome, and the Crusades is a lot closer than they're saying. If we look at Bible prophecy, we have these two beasts, the beast of the sea, which is the Mediterranean, the beast of the earth, which is east of Jerusalem, and we have these two beasts being destroyed at the same time as the whore. They're destroyed in the fire at the end, and they both go down at the same time. So when the woman is burnt, the Bible tells us in Revelation 20 that when the dragon is thrown into the lake of fire, it says where the beast of the earth, the beast of the sea, the false prophet are already. You know, like the fact that we have this Western Roman Empire, this Byzantine Roman Empire that goes for a further 1,000 years after the Western Roman Empire, I think that there's something wrong here, but this is just my opinion. I can't prove that. If we look at the Byzantine Empire, it says it's the eastern half of the Roman Empire which survived for 1,000 years after the western half had crumbled into various feudal kingdoms which finally fell to Ottoman Turkish onslaughts in 1453. So Constantine the Great was Roman emperor from 306 to 337 AD. This would be around the time the dragon spews forth its water. Probably earlier than this, the dragon started working against the saints, against the true teaching of Christianity. He built a new imperial residence at the city of Byzantium and renamed it Constantinople. This was Eastern Rome, while the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 of the current era. Constantinople became the empire's largest city, a major commercial center. The Eastern Roman Empire reaped having nearly all of the most prosperous provinces. The population in the Byzantine Empire was way higher than the Western Empire. So the Western Roman Empire was conquered by the Goths, the Germans. I mean, here we have a picture of the Basilica Cistern underneath Istanbul or Constantinople. It was built by Justinian in the year 527 to 565. And it looks almost Gothic, like Gothic architecture. Gothic architecture is dated from around the 12th to the 16th century, not the 6th or the 5th century. And it's during the High and Late Middle Ages. So maybe there's a clue there to whether there's a missing gap of time in the architecture if we have a look into this later on. When Western Rome fell, it is said this was the start of the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages as a term has undergone many evolutions. Its definition depends on who is defining it. Indeed, modern historians no longer use the term because of its negative connotation. Generally, the Dark Ages referred to the period of time ushered in by the fall of the Western Roman Empire. This took place when the last Western Emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by Odoacer, a barbarian. AD 476 was the time of this event. Initially, this era took the term dark by later onlookers. This was due to the backward ways and practices that seemed to prevail during this time. Future historians use the term dark simply to denote the fact that little was known about this period. There was a paucity of written history. Recent discoveries have apparently altered this perception, as many new facts about this time have been uncovered. The Italian scholar Franco Petrarca, called Petrarch, was the first to coin the phrase. He used it to denounce Latin literature of that time. Others expanded on this idea to express frustration with the lack of Latin literature during this time or other cultural achievements. While the term Dark Ages was no longer widely used, it may best be described as early Middle Ages, the period following the decline of Rome in the Western world. The Middle Ages is loosely considered to extend from 400 to 1000 AD. So we're told that the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium or Byzantine, fell in 1453. That's 1,000 years after the Western Roman Empire fell. And there seems to be some inconsistencies here. I mean, this is an awfully long time for an empire to run, 1,000 years under the same rule. It says the Byzantine Empire fell in 1453. The immediate cause of its fall was pressure by the Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans had been fighting the Byzantines for over 100 years. By this time, in 1454, Constantinople finally fell to them, and their conquest to the Byzantine Empire and their conquest of the Byzantine Empire was complete. So this had everything to do with the Crusades and the Muslim armies pushing through from the east and taking over the Byzantine Empire. But I think here there's an anomaly in the dates. I think that, we look at the Western Roman Empire fell in 470, 450, around that time. And now we have the Eastern Empire falling 1,000 years later from the east. The Western Empire was attacked from the Western Goths. The Eastern Empire was attacked by the Eastern Turks and the Islamic faith. We have Constantine starting the Eastern Empire in 306 to 337. And we have this crusade timeline of around 1096 to 1099 for the first crusade. And in some ways, I think that this is where the history has been fudged. I think that perhaps, I can't prove it, and this is the problem with trying to prove that history's been changed, is we just don't have the records. I guess I might go into looking into this time period deeper and see if I can find anything. But we have the fall of Western Rome. Is it possible that the fall of Eastern Rome was a lot closer to the timeline of the fall of Western Rome, and that the Crusades were actually an earlier date related to the fall of these two empires? And that would put us in a timeline of around 600 AD. And, it's funny because we have these date markers that have the I and the J in front of them that seem to change around 16 or 1700. And I've got a few here that were given to me by a subscriber, Emily. Thanks, Emily. It's taken me a long time to get around to doing this video. And I believe these photos have been taken around the region of Dorset in England. I think that this dating information regarding buildings and tombstones, mile markers, things like that is really interesting. And as I said, a lot of the I and J before the date markers seem to change around the 1700s. This would put the time for these markers, if they have an I and a J before them, around 600 and 700 AD. So if this is the period of history we're looking at where things are being changed or fudged, it appears to be that perhaps after the fall of Jerusalem through the Crusades and the fall of Western and Eastern Rome, perhaps after this is when we have the 1,000-year millennial period. And then around our current time, 1666, 1700, is when we have this little season where the dragon is again released and able to wreak havoc on the world. The dragon being the banking system, the merchant system, and the trading system. Now, the Silk Road fell as a result of the crusade, or as a result of Christianity fighting with Islam and not being able to cross over in the Levant region. So we had Western Europe Christian, we had Eastern nations Islam, and no trade was able to cross between, unless of course you were a Radhanite or a Ashkenazi Khazarian Jew, and you could trade between these countries. But as we know, they were very corrupt. They traded in slaves, and they manipulated borrowing with usury, and they caused a lot of havoc in nations, and a lot of people in the long run kicked them out. For example, the Viking Russians, they were pushed into Europe, they were pushed out of Europe regarding the libel situation and the banking and usury situation, and people just didn't like them. They destroyed communities. They ended up in Amsterdam and the Netherlands. They created the Dutch East Indies Company. They were in Venice. They became sea traders after the fall of the Silk Road. There was always a sea trade, but it became the dominant trading system, and that sort of came to the forefront around this time of 1600. So when we look at or Google, when did the Dutch East Indies Company start? We have 1602. The Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company started in 1602 in the Dutch Republic, the present-day Netherlands, as a trading company with the headquarters in Amsterdam. The original purpose of the company was to protect the trade going on in the Indian Ocean, as well as to assist in obtaining Dutch independence from Spain. That's because Spain had kicked all the Jews out of their country. When did the British East India Company start? Same time, 1600. So we have this merchant system starting to boom again on sea trade. As I said, it had always sort of been there from the Venetians, but this is when they really started to become powerful, because the Silk Road declined. They were not able to trade on the Silk Road across land, and it declined. And, not till this day, they're trying to resurrect the Silk Road in the Belt and Road project. It's taken them how many years to try to bring down all those countries in between Jerusalem, in between Europe and China, to try to get this project going. We've had Afghanistan, we've had Libya, we've had Iraq. They still have Iran as a problem. And all of these volatile nations in between that threaten the big Israel Belt and Road project. And I believe that this is the dragon, the beast, trying to resurrect the old Silk Road. But according to the Bible, the old Silk Road is when the whore gets burnt and the merchants stand back and wail, then we are told that she will never ever be found again, and they will not resurrect this Belt and Road project, or this big Israel project will never ever happen. So the maritime Silk Road route, one of these Red Sea routes, ended at the terminus city of Suez, where the goods were carried overland to Cairo, then were sailed down the Nile to the city of Alexandria, and on across the Mediterranean Sea to the Sicilian Peninsula, from whence they were traded throughout Europe. So an alternative route ended near the ancient Nabatean city of Petra, from whence the goods were transported to Nabatea's port cities along the Mediterranean and then onward to Sicily. Much of the Middle East at the time was still under the rule of Rome, though with the advent of Islam under the Prophet Muhammad in 632 to 732, whole swathes of the Middle East, including Syria, Mesopotamia, and Arabia, were wrested from Roman control. The traders who actually transported the Oriental goods across the Mediterranean during this period may well themselves have been descendants of the ancient Phoenicians, who had polled their trade across the Mediterranean from BC 1500 to BC 300, when the Phoenicians were eventually conquered by Rome. Phoenicia comprised roughly the strip of land on which present-day Israel sits, plus parts of ancient Syria and present-day Lebanon. Nabatea lay south of this in what is present-day Lebanon. Now, the Phoenicians mixed with the Nabatean Edomites, and later the Edomites pushed out by the Arabs. They were one big group of traders on the Silk Road. By the middle of the 15th century, barely a century after the decline of the overland Silk Road route, most of the volume of the maritime Silk Road trade had ceased as well. A limited maritime Silk Road trade in the most exquisite items of the Ming-Qing dynasties continued. So the decline of the Silk Road after the great geographical discoveries in the late 15th and early 16th century, the intercontinental overland trade routes fell to decay. The speed of the sea transportation and possibility to carry more goods, relative cheapness of transportation resulted in the decline of the Silk Road in the end of the 15th century, although some of the routes, especially those in the high mountainous areas connecting Tajikistan, Afghanistan, China, Pakistan and India, existed until the beginning of the 20th century. In this article, The Merchants of Venice, History of the Konkani People and Language by Tenzing Rodriguez, it mentions that in the 12th century, let us now return to the Jewish connection of Camp Draper. The 11th and 12th centuries witnessed considerable participation of Jewish merchants in the Indian Ocean trade. In the large number of letters exchanged between them bears ample testimony to regular voyages between the west coast of India and Aden. From Aden, the goods moved further to Venice. We look at two of these letters from the Cairo Genesa collection at Cambridge to understand the nature and extent of this trade and the importance of Camdrapur, Sindabur therein. So we can see that the Jews were the merchants on this maritime Silk Road in the 11th and 12th century. After the decline of the Silk Road, they moved to maritime. They were trading in Venice, the merchants of Venice, and then in the 16th century, we have 17th century, we have the rise of the Dutch and British East India Company. We know who run those companies. They were those that called themselves Jews, the traders on the Silk and the merchant maritime road. And so, can I prove that there is a time discrepancy between the fall of West and Eastern Rome, the Crusades, and the fall of the Silk Road? This is the problem with talking about missing history. It's been hidden. It's been hidden deliberately from us. So if this did happen, then it's going to be hard to prove it. We're going to have to prove it through something that they've missed or forgotten, which shows that they've made mistakes or there's holes in their story. So, given these time markers of in the year of our Lord, I and J before the date, I think that these merchants of the sea have taken over around 1600 to 1600. Around that time has been the rise of the dragon, where he's been unchained, and we're now in this little season. So that would leave us with a small period up until to the tribulation or the persecution of the church, the burning of the whore, the 1,000-year period in between. So this 1,000-year period started around 600, 700 AD. Then we have this 1700 AD time change. And then possibly the little season after that. Then comes Revelation 20. This is just my take on it. As I said, it's It's taken me a long time to do this video because we can't prove it without solid evidence. Okay, so if we just want to look at the history of Christian persecution, and we have the first Christian persecution starting by the Roman Empire. When we look into what happened there, we had a lot of Christians being burnt at the stake or killed in the gladiator fights. This ran for a few hundred years through the Roman period, up around until 3 to 700 AD, when Constantine converted the Roman kingdom into his version of Christianity. The persecution of the Christians came to an end. Wikipedia tells us that the persecution of Christians occurred sporadically and usually locally throughout the Roman Empire, beginning in the 1st century AD and ending in the 4th century AD. When we look at Christian persecution, it starts in the book of Acts, early Christian martyrdoms, persecution of the Roman Empire. So the Christian persecution started in Jerusalem and in Israel, and it followed them throughout the Roman Empire, and it was put an end to by Constantine when Constantine came into office in 306 AD. Constantine restored Christians to full legal equality and returned property to them that had been confiscated. In 13 AD, he signed the Edict of Milan, which offered Christians a comprehensive acceptance. Constantine himself had converted to Christianity when he had a vision of a Christian symbol which helped him to win a battle at his seat as the Roman emperor. So it seems that from the time of Constantine, there was a time of peace for Christian believers. We have the medieval Inquisition in the 1184 to 1230, and they were mainly inquisitions against the Cathars. And the Cathars were a group of dissidents, mostly in the south of France, in cities like Toulouse. The sect developed in the 12th century, apparently founded by soldiers from the Second Crusade, who on their way back were converted by the Bulgarian sect Bogomils. The Cathars' main heresy was their belief in dualism. We know that dualism isn't a Christian theology, it's Zoroastrian, so they were in the wrong here. The evil God created the materialistic world, and the good God created the spiritual world. Therefore, Cathars preach poverty, chastity, modesty, and all those values which in their view helped people to detach themselves from materialism. The Cathars presented a problem to feudal government by their attitude towards oaths, which they declared under no circumstance allowable. Therefore, considering the religious homogeneity of the age, heresy was an attack against social and political order besides orthodoxy. The Albigensian Crusade resulted in the defeat of the Cathars military. After this, the Inquisition played an important role in finally destroying Catharism during the 13th and much of the 14th centuries. Punishment for Cathars varied greatly. Most frequently, they were made to wear yellow crosses atop their garments as a sign of outward penance. Others undertook obligatory pilgrimages, many for the purpose of fighting against Muslims. Other common punishments included for returned pilgrims was visiting a local church naked once each month to be scourged. Cathars who were slow to repent suffered imprisonment and often loss of property. Others who altogether refused to repent were burnt. So, even though this is a persecution of a type of Christianity, it's not really a mass persecution and death for anyone wishing to follow Christianity. And if you were conservative in your Christian beliefs, you could probably avoid any problems from the Catholic authorities at this time. The Waldensians were mostly in Germany and North Italy. The Waldensians were a group of Orthodox laymen concerned about the increasing wealth of the church. Well, this is a good point. As time passed, however, they found their beliefs at odds with Catholic teaching. In contrast with the Cathars and in line with the church, they believed in only one God, but they did not recognize a special class of priesthood, believing in the priesthood of all believers. They also objected to the veneration of saints and martyrs, which were part of the church's orthodoxy. They rejected the sacramental authority of the church and its clerics and encouraged apostolic poverty. These movements became particularly popular in southern France as well as northern Italy and parts of the Holy Roman Empire. So the punishment from this Inquisition, it says that a council in Tours in 1164, presided over by Pope Alexander III, ordered the confiscation of a heretic's goods of 5,400 people interrogated in Toulouse between 1245 and 1246. 184 received penitential yellow crosses used to mark repentant Cathars. 23 were imprisoned for life, and none were sent to the stake. The most extreme penalty available in antheretical proceedings was reserved for relapsed or stubborn heretics. The unrepented and apostate could be relaxed to secular authority, however, opening the convicted to the possibility of various corporal punishment up to and including being burned at the stake. Execution was neither performed by the church, nor was it a sentence available to the officials involved in the Inquisition, who, as clerics, were forbidden to kill. The accused also faced the possibility that his or her property might be confiscated. In some cases, accusers may have been motivated by a desire to take the property of the accused, though this is a difficult assertion to prove in the majority of areas where the Inquisition was active, as the Inquisition had several layers of oversight built into its framework in the specific attempts to limit prosecution or misconduct. The Inquisition generally preferred not to hand over heretics to the secular arm for execution if they could persuade the heretic to repent. And the church knows not blood. For example, of the 900 guilty verdicts levied against 636 individuals by the Dominican friar and inquisitor Bernard Gui, no more than 45 resulted in execution. So, by the 14th century, the Waldensians had been driven underground. Some residents of the Pays Cathar identify themselves as Cathars. Even today, they claim to be descended from the Cathars of the Middle Ages. So there were a few persecutions through this period from the time of Constantine to around the time of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. But they were not persecutions where mass amounts of people were brought to the slaughter, as we're led to believe through the popular culture. There was a persecution of John Wycliffe in the 1300s, and he was an English scholastic philosopher, theologian, biblical translator, reformer, Catholic priest, and a seminary professor at the University of Oxford. He became an influential dissident within the Roman Catholic priesthood during the 14th century and is considered an important predecessor to Protestantism. Wycliffe questioned the privileged status of the clergy, who had bolstered their powerful role in England, and the luxury and pomp of local parishes and their ceremonies. So despite these persecutions, Wycliffe did not die by the hand of the church. He died from a stroke. It wasn't to his death that they posthumously declared him a heretic. So the Council of Constance declared Wycliffe a heretic on the 4th of May 1415 and banned his writings, effectively both excommunicating him retroactively and making him an early forerunner for Protestantism. So we have a lot of persecution of Christians in Islamic areas, but when it comes to Western Europe, we don't see any more real persecution until we get to the Protestant Reformation and Counter-Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation and the Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation provoked a number of persecutions of Christianity by other Christians and European wars of religion, including the 80 Years' War, the French Wars of Religion, the 30 Years' War, the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, and the Savoyard-Waldensian Wars, the Toggenburg War. There were false allegations of witchcraft and numerous witch trials in the early modern period. So persecutions for crime of witchcraft reached a high point in 1580 to 1630. So this is when the persecutions start up again around the late 1500s to the 1600s, and this time period comes up again. During the Counter-Reformation and the European Wars of Religion, when an estimated 50,000 people were executed, with some regions burning those convicted at the stake, of whom roughly 80% were women, and most often over the age of 40. In the French Revolution, we have the start of the Age of Reason, and this was really the beginning of the age of philosophy and a lot of the mystery religion cults or philosophies creeping in to the Western culture. For example, the cult of reason. The worship of reason was France's first established state-sponsored atheistic religion, intended as a replacement for Catholicism during the French Revolution. After holding sway for barely a year, in 1794 it was officially replaced by the cult of the Supreme Being, promoted by Robespierre. Both cults were officially banned in 1802 by Napoleon Bonaparte, with the Law on Cults of 18 Germinal Year 10, or X. So Maximilien Francois Marie Isidore de Robespierre was a French lawyer and statesman who became one of the best known, influential and controversial figures of the French Revolution. As a member of the Estates General, the Constituent Assembly, and the Jacobin Club. So the Jacobins were really influential in the humanistic movements, and he campaigned for universal manhood suffrage, the right to vote for people of color, Jews or actors, the abolition of both clerical celibacy and slavery in France. Now, all this sounds wonderful, but when we look into the Jacobins, they're another of these mystery religion cults that are linked to the Talmudic clans. It's an early form of Bolshevism, initially founded in 1789 by the anti-royalist deputies from Brittany. The club grew into a nationwide Republican movement with a membership estimated at 500,000 or more. In chapter 3 of The Men Who Caused the French Revolution, 1789, it says, in the previous chapter, evidence was given to prove how a small group of foreign moneylenders operating through their English agents remained anonymous while they secured control of that nation's economy for the modest sum of £1,250,000. Evidence will now be produced to identify some of these international Jewish moneylenders and prove they or their successors plotted to planned and helped finance the Great French Revolution of 1789, exactly the same way as they had plotted and planned and financed the English Revolution of 1640 and 1649. In succeeding chapters, evidence will be produced to prove that the descendants of these same international Jewish financiers have been the secret power behind every war and revolution from 1789 onwards. And, we've got 1640, the 1600s, around this time that I'm proposing that the beast was unchained. The Jewish moneylenders were behind the Jacobin The Spanish Inquisition was not so much a inquisition against Christians, but Jews, or crypto Jews who were pretending to be Christians. Creation of the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition is interpretable as a response to the multi-religious nature of Spanish society following the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslim Moors. The Reconquista did not result in the total expulsion of Muslims from Spain, since they, along with Jews, were tolerated by the ruling Christian elite. Large cities, especially Seville, Valladolid, and Barcelona, had significant Jewish population centered on Judea, but the coming years the Muslims became increasingly alienated and relegated from power centers. Post-conquest medieval Spain has been characterized by Americo Castro as a society of relatively peaceful coexistence, punctuated by occasional conflict among the ruling Catholics and the Jews and Muslims. As historian Henry Kamen notes, the so-called convivencia was always a relationship between unequals. Despite their legal inequality, there was a long tradition of Jewish service to the Crown of Aragon. The Jews occupied many important posts, both religious and political. Castile itself had an unofficial rabbi. Ferdinand's father John II named the Jewish Abiathar Crescus court astronomer. Anti-Semitic attitudes increased all over Europe during the late 13th century, and throughout the 14th century, England and France expelled their Jewish population in 1290 and 1306, respectively. At the same time, during the Reconquista, Spain's anti-Jewish sentiment steadily increased. The prejudice climaxed in summer of 1391 when the violent anti-Jewish riots broke out in Spain cities like Barcelona. To linguistically distinguish them from non-converted or long-established Catholic families, new converts were called conversos, or New Catholics. This event must be understood in the context of the fierce civil war and politics that Peter the Cruel had brought to the land, and not be confused with spontaneous anti-Semitic reactions to the plague seen in Northern Europe. So this Inquisition forced baptism on the Jews and a forced conversion. So the Spanish Inquisition was mainly about Jews, Jewish money lenders, Jewish conversions, and the Spanish nation having a problem with them in their nation and forcing them out. If we look at this again, I'm not saying this chart here is 100% accurate, but it's sort of all I can find online. You know, it's not till around 1600s, but that we see this schism with the church, and that we see major Christian persecution coming back again. And not only Christian persecution and harm to them physically, but we see this movement rising up that wants to destroy Christianity altogether with humanism, the Age of Reason. And then we see in the 19th century the Jewish philosophers, Marx and Engels, and atheism, Darwinism, and this constant wearing down of Christian thought and destroying Christian principles within society to replace it with the philosophy that is beneficial to these dragon people. So I guess you could say that for around 1,000-year period, Christians have received a somewhat peaceful time where they are not under persecution from the dragon or from Gog Magog. And then around the 1600s, we see the rise of these secular movements, these philosophies of the Pharisees, and we see banking and usury coming back. Now, this is a Byzantine sculpture or tablet, and what's interesting is I think that some of these headstones have a similar look or shape and texture to them. There's no writing on this. The writing on the headstones is in English, but if we go to when did the English language develop? It is said that the English language originated in 449 AD with the arrival of the British islands of Germanic tribes, the Saxons, the Angles, and the Jutes from what is now Denmark and Germany. So at the beginning of the Old English, it is said that English language originated in 449. Prior to this arrival, the inhabitants of the British Isles are believed to have spoken ancient Celtic, a language whose contemporary variations still exist in places around Britain, Welsh being the most obvious example. After locals moved further north, English, the language spoken by the Angle tribes, started to spread across South Britain. It is around this time, 700 to 1000 AD, that Old English's most important epic was written, Beowulf. It is the longest poem in Old English and famously narrates the story of fights between Beowulf and bloodthirsty monsters Grendel's mother, and a dragon. Now here's some writing from Beowulf. The beginning of the Beowulf in digitized image. Cadman's Hymn is another Old English piece of writing. It is a short Old English poem attributed to Cadman, a supposedly illiterate and unmusical cowherder who was, according to the Northumbrian monk Bede, 731, miraculously empowered to sing in honor of God, the Creator. The poem is Cadman's only known composition. The poem has a claim of being the oldest surviving English poem. If Bede's account is correct, the poem was composed between 658 and 680 AD, in the early stage of the Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England. Now, if we have a look at this writing, is it legible? Not particularly. I don't think we could really consider English in that sense that it's legible, but the writing does look quite neat and fluid, and the alphabet is very clear. I don't know, maybe the English in these tablets is too far developed for this timeline, but you know, it falls within a similar time span. 727, 684, 7. Can't read that last one, but you know, 400 is around, 460 is around the time that English was first developed. So here's some images of Romanesque architecture, and Romanesque architecture is the architecture that came from the period between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Gothic period. There's some Romanesque architecture here, and I actually find that a lot of the architecture that's considered Tartarian is actually Romanesque. Romanesque carvings. Here's some images of American Romanesque architecture. So a lot of these buildings that are considered Tartarian in the New World, America, Australia, other places that people say there's ancient architecture that has been reclaimed rather than built in a neo-Romanesque style, is actually a Romanesque style of architecture that may have just been reclaimed from this time period. Romanesque architecture is from around the time period of 600, 800 AD, and obviously through to the Gothic style, which comes around 1200 to 1500 AD. So here we have the Smithsonian Castle, Washington, D.C., and they're calling it Neo-Romanesque. Perhaps it's just Romanesque. So we've got the definitive architectural style of Capitol Hill is neoclassical, inspired by the use of ancient Greek and Roman designs of great public buildings. These styles are recognized by the use of tall columns, symmetrical shapes, triangular pediments, and domed roofs. So Romanesque architecture is an architecture style of medieval Europe characterized by semicircular arches. There is no consensus for the beginning date of Romanesque style, with proposals ranging from the 6th to the 11th centuries. This later date being the most commonly held. In the 12th century, it developed into the Gothic style, marked by pointed arches. Examples of Romanesque architecture can be found across the continent, making it the first pan-European architectural style since Imperial Roman architecture. The Romanesque style in England is traditionally referred to as Norman architecture, not Tartarian. And this is Romanesque architecture in the period, which is from around the 6th century. This is the Basilica of Istanbul. It actually has a bit of a Capitol Hill feel about it with the domes. The Hagia Sophia, known as the Great Church or Magna Ecclesia in Latin, the first church was built at the same location where there had been a pagan temple before. It was Constantius II who inaugurated Hagia Sophia on 15th of February 360. So this building was actually built in the 3rd century. We know that the church was built by the orders of Constantine the Great. The first church was a wooden roofed basilica with a nave flanked by 2 or 4 aisles. It was preceded by an atrium. The church was largely burned down in 404 during riots since Patriarch John Chrysostom was sent into exile by the Emperor Arcadius.
If you would have told them that the term we use for them is Byzantines and that they belong to the Byzantine Empire, it is quite possible that you would not have received a friendly response and might have ended beaten up in an alleyway of Constantinople. But why then do we use this term to refer to the later Eastern Roman Empire, which survived the fall of the West by 1,000 more years? The term Byzantine Empire was first coined by the historian and humanist Hieronymus Wolff, who lived from AD 1516 to 1580 in what was then the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. This political entity existed from 962 until 1806, and as the name implies, the Holy Roman Emperors attempted to revive a Roman Empire, and they saw themselves as legitimate successors to the Roman Empire. We shall talk in great detail about the Holy Roman Empire and its claims to legitimacy of Roman continuation in another video. So Hieronymus Wolff grew up in the midst of the Holy Roman Empire, and in 1557, so a bit over 100 years after the fall of Constantinople, he published his work Corpus Historiae Byzantinae. This was when the term Byzantine Empire was introduced for the first time. This work was a collection of literary sources from the Eastern Roman Empire until the fall of Constantinople. But why did he not refer to the political entity of the Greek-speaking successor state of the Roman Empire as the Roman Empire? Well, the answer is of course obviously because he lived in an empire that saw itself as the legitimate successor of the Roman Empire, and therefore there could only be one legitimate successor of the Roman Empire. Thus, the Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire could not also be referred to as the Roman Empire, and hence a new term had to be introduced in order to differentiate that empire from its Roman past. And so was the term Byzantine Empire born, referring to the Greek name of the city of Constantinople before it was named such after the 4th century AD.
So if I was to say what period the mud-flooded buildings came from, I would have to say that they were Romanesque. And some of the features of Romanesque architecture are obviously the Roman pillars and some styles of sculpture, but mainly the rounded or arched windows. So Romanesque of or relating to style of architecture developed in Italy and Western Europe between the Roman and the Gothic styles and characterized in its development after 1000 by the use of the round arch and vault, substitution of piers for columns, decorative use of arcades and profuse ornament. If we look at this picture here, the underneath building that is covered in mud and earth has the arched windows. The pillars continue on in the upper buildings, but the windows here are square. In this building here, same with this building here, it's clearly Romanesque. It has rounded arches. Again, this is Rome, and we have the Romanesque buildings here. We've got the Colosseum. So we have the Roman period, then we have the Romanesque period, followed by the Gothic period of architecture. And we see other pictures of Rome covered in mud and earth, and it would appear that something happened after this Romanesque period or around this Romanesque period. And we have these buildings here, Sofia Grand Hotel. I'm wondering if this is in Istanbul. So we have the dome buildings which match the Basilica in Istanbul. The windows which are arched, squarish but arched. They kind of match the type of windows they use in the 19th century, which they called a neo-Romanesque period of architecture. They used a lot of neo-Romanesque styles, and I guess we just have to ask the question, was it new? Was it new Romanesque, or was it just simply Romanesque? This one here is a popular image to me. Again, it looks from the later Roman Empire. If you go back and watch my other videos on Are We in the Little Season of Satan, I believe that there were two cataclysm events shown in Revelation. The first happened at 70 AD at the destruction of Jerusalem, and we can see in the timeline of Revelation it's divided into 3 sections. The second cataclysmic event happened at the end of the period of the beasts and when the whore is burnt, and I believe that happened around the time of the Crusades. Now, the Crusades happened during the Romanesque time period, and if the beast, which would have been the Roman Empire, which is the Mediterranean, the beast of the sea, and the beast of the earth, which I believe was the Islamic Empire, the two were fighting in the Crusades. Some people say that it's East and West, Western Rome, Eastern Rome. It could be that. I could be wrong. But either way, we have these two beasts. The beast that has the false prophet. The reason I say it's Islamic is because I believe the false prophet is Muhammad. But we can see that in the context of Revelation, the two beasts are destroyed along with the woman who rides the beast. And I think that happened during the Crusades. Now, I think that this is the period where the timeline has been really fudged to it. And if this cataclysm happened at the time of, or time after the Crusades, this is when the millennial reign starts, 1,000 years. And we would see evidence of this, and I think we do in the mud floods. The Roman architecture, which has a layer of ash, has a layer of burnt soil over the top of it. And we're seeing that was the Roman Empire during the first cataclysm. And I think that the mud floods and the buildings that have been resurrected from the earth that's covering them has to do with the Crusader period. I think after this, we have the millennial reign, and it's possible that the Byzantine Empire didn't run for, the Eastern Roman Empire didn't run for 1,000 years after the decline of the Western Roman Empire. And it's possible that the timeline of the Crusade happened around that same time. If we look at when did the Byzantine Empire fall, it says the rise of the Byzantine Empire occurred simultaneously with the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, I'm going to show a video on the fall of the Roman Empire to show that it never really fell, it just declined. And power went to, or was in, the Eastern Empire. The power and influence of the Roman Empire began in the 3rd century current era, in the period that saw the empire plagued with civil wars caused by the collapse of administrative structures. Constantine I ascended to power in the 4th century and later in the 330s current era established Constantinople as his seat of power. Constantinople was founded on the site of an existing city known as Byzantium, from which the empire got its name. Constantine's successors continued expanding the empire, ultimately leading to the Byzantine Empire to cover most of the Mediterranean region, encompassing Egypt, Sicily, Italy, Greece, and Rome. The empire was combating numerous challenges throughout his history, and some of which ultimately led to its demise during the late Antiquity period. The Byzantine Empire faced invasions from Attila the Hun, the Visigoths, the Vandals, and the Alans from numerous fronts. The 5th century was marked by the rise of Islam in the Mediterranean, with the Arabs engaging in war with the Byzantine Empire, which led to the fall of Egypt and the Levant between 634. So that's a lot earlier than the Crusades, which happened about 400 to 500 years later. And the Battle of Yarmouk in 636 current era between the Byzantine Empire and the Rashidun Caliphate saw the empire experience another humiliating defeat. After the victory of the Arabs revved up their campaigns against the empire and succeeded to conquer Asia Minor, Sicily, Crete, and Cyprus, the fall of Egypt was a major blow to the Byzantine Empire, as the region was an important source of grain and manufactured goods. In the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire saw the rise of another challenge in the form of Seljuk Empire, with the two empires clashing in the Battle of Manzikert in August 1071. So we've seen this empire running for 300 years before they have the battle with the Rashidun Caliphate. Then we see a further 400 years where they have a battle with the Seljuk Empire. That's a massive timeline in between. You know, that's 700 years. That's a long time if we think about it. 700 years ago from our time is, you know, the 1300s, the Middle Ages. You know, that's a really long amount of time in between these fights. I think that there's something fishy here, that maybe the historians have expanded the time here. I mean, who was ruling our Earth 700 years ago? It certainly wasn't the British Empire. I mean, our British Empire ran for about 400 years. The American Empire has been dominant only for about just over 100 years. Obviously, it's the same aristocratic families behind these empires, shifting powers. However, a lot can change in 200 years, let alone 700 years. So it was over 450 years later that Pope Urban II orders for the first crusade to be called in the attempt for the Byzantine Empire or Eastern Rome to take back the Holy Land that had been taken from them by the Islamic nations. And, so 450 years after they first took over this region of Israel, or in that time Judea. I mean, for this Byzantine Empire to, at that point in 1071, have been running for nearly 700 years. The humiliating defeat was compounded with Byzantine's loss of Armenia and Anatolia to the Seljuk Empire. The century also saw the invasion of the Normans, who had captured vast territories in Italy by the 12th century. I'm proposing that this time period is the time period that they've fudged, that they've expanded, and I think that the Eastern Roman Empire lasted a little bit longer than the Western, but was probably in the same vicinity, and I think that the Crusades happened a lot earlier than they're saying that they did. Also, this time period, when you go to look into historical genealogies, it gets very blurry at this phase. So they seem to have a lot of information on the Roman Empire, families, genealogies, and then they cut off and then they start back up again around the year 1200 or thereabouts. So it's very hard to link the ancient Roman Empire to the modern Holy Roman Empire aristocracy. Even though the links are there, there's just this big gap of history around this time period that goes quiet. Who knows? I'm not sure if they've actually added 1,000 years to history, or they've hidden 1,000 years of history, or the timeline itself is the same. They've just changed information about the history. If we consider the biblical timeline, it might be that the burning of the beasts and the whore happened around the time of the Crusades. If the Crusades happened earlier, around the year 6 or 700 AD, that brings us to around the time period, if we add 1,000 years to that, of the millennial period to the 1600s, our current era. And then if we add the extra 353 or 356 years, that brings us to this day. We could consider this to be the little season. Then the time period would actually fit to what we have. But we still have this problem with the history being dragged out or being said to have happened at certain period that doesn't fit a biblical timeline to this narrative. I'm going to do another video on this person, James Ussher, and the information regarding Crusader history and who wrote and dated the Crusader history. It's kind of interesting in regards to biblical chronology.